You can hear me, touch your right ear level. If you can hear me, touch your left eyebrow. Very nice. If you can hear me, place your hands on your desk in front of you. And smile. Oh, very nice. Okay, my friends. Business time is over. Everything's set. We're ready to go. I'm glad to see many of you are already in your placement classrooms. If you're not yet, keep at it. You'll get in there, no problem. What are we in? Third or fourth week of school? So doing good. So today we're going to be talking about managing behavior, and specifically we have our fabulous guest speaker. This is,
hi, I'm Amanda Zimmerman. I am an elementary school principal in Davis, California. Yes, at North Davis Elementary.
So she will, I think when we can, well, you know what, we're going to kind of be really fluid when we switch over, so maybe you want to give them a few things about your education background.
Sure.
And how you became an administrator.
Sure.
Because she actually, I met her and we taught together.
Yeah, Cassie and I.
That's great.
Cassie and I met my first year teaching. That's how we met. So I have a undergraduate degree in early childhood development with an emphasis on cognitive development from Sacramento State. Go Hornets. And then I got my master's degree in education and my teaching credential from UC Davis. And I also got my administrative credential from, well, a combination of UC Davis and Sac State. So that's my educational background. While I was an undergrad, your guys' age, I taught preschool on campus as my job. And then after that, after I graduated, I did my student teaching in Davis, and then I taught 7th and 8th grade humanities. That's where I met Cassie, our first year at a public charter school for Sikhs at a Sikh temple. And then I taught kindergarten for 4 years. And then I became the vice principal of the school that I was working at. And this year is my first year as principal at North Davis Elementary. So that's a little bit about my background.
And talk about if you would find your kindergarten classroom and kind of you're at a new school now, but that other school that you used to work at had a very specific population.
Yeah, so the first school I taught kindergarten at, and then I became the vice principal of that school. It was a dual language immersion program in Spanish. And we had a very interesting population because Davis is very affluent. It's an upper middle class community, and because of the university, it's a big university town. But we also have it's agricultural land, right? And so we have a large migrant population and a large Hispanic population that's lower middle class, and so we had sort of this issue at my site where we called it, it was white flight, right? So the school was zoned so that basically all the lower income, there's only a few spots in Davis that are lower income, they were all funneled into our school. And it was built in the neighborhood that houses the richest, it's in the middle of the richest community. So we had extreme things on both sides. We had extremely wealthy, and then, migrant students, and the trailer park was zoned for us, and the Section 8 housing was zoned for us. And what was happening was, after a few years of the school opening, when I started working there, we had white flight. So all the white families registered their students at other schools because they didn't want their kids going to school with lower socioeconomic kids of color. And so it was like a really long, hard process to figure out how to solve that, and to solve the segregation issue, and to solve an issue of equality. And one way that we went about it is offering a dual language program. So 50% of our students have to speak Spanish. They're the native Spanish speakers. And 50% of our students can speak a language other than Spanish. And we do our instruction 100% in Spanish. So essentially we're attracting families who speak things other than Spanish, who want their children to learn Spanish. So we're attracting those people back to our program, and we're offering the best educational outcomes for students of color, students who speak Spanish already. They become fully biliterate by the end of 6th grade.
So that's just something for you all to know, that if you're someone that has language abilities, you know what I mean, and especially if you know Spanish, that
I cannot hire enough teachers that speak Spanish. It is hard all the time. I mean, it is hard to find teachers who speak Spanish. So if you do speak Spanish, it is a huge asset and something you should think about to becoming a Spanish immersion teacher.
And we have a dual language program here on campus. So that's just an FYI for you all to know. So great. Now we kind of have a good sense of where Amanda's coming from. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pass over some of the things from your book that are really important and basic for us to talk about. And then she's going to transition into what she does every day, which is managing a school, dealing with discipline issues, and most of the time, actually, though, more about, well, she does what we call restorative practices. So that's kind of tricky in terms of elementary education, but she does work with that in her school, so she'll share a little bit of that with us. Okay, so onward. Sorry about the date. Okay, so right now I just want to start out with this photograph, and you're going to see we have two different things here. Let's just talk about it. What do you see? No tricks, just tell me straight up. What do you see? Read the visual. What? Carrots next to sticks, carrots and sticks. So you might kind of know what that is. What do you see on the other side? Heart. That's on fire. That's on fire. I don't think this is like a fire emergency. This is more of a metaphor. This is a metaphor. So as we get further into this, I'm going to bring this back, and it's going to make more sense to you. A heart on fire. So here's where our notes start, everybody. Perfect. So behaviorism. When we're talking about psychology and educational psychology, we have like three kind of realms. So there's cognitivism, constructivism, or sometimes we call it more like humanism, and then behaviorism. And so obviously it's the scientific study of behavior. And for behaviorists, because depending on which school of thought you live within, where your strategy, your identification, you view learning differently based on what your foundations are. So people that are behaviorists, they believe that learning is a permanent change in behavior. That's exactly what it is. If you learn something, it's that you have changed your behavior. And then, of course, the assumption within behaviorism is that behavior is something that is learned. It's not just something that happens. It's something that children and people learn to do, largely because of what our interactions with society, things around us. And a really important kind of a term in terms of behaviorism is the idea of conditioning. So with conditioning, we create a situation that results in learning or results in change of behavior. And then, of course, here we've got some notable theorists in terms of behaviorism. Well, we're not going to talk about all of them. So the first one we want to talk about is classical conditioning. If you've taken any psychology class, you've probably heard about this before. But the way classical conditioning works, or if we think about our good old Pavlov, if you recall the story of Pavlov, is quite simply here. So what he did is he wanted to see if he could create learning or create a change of behavior in a dog by ringing a bell and then presenting a stimulus. So in the first case, he rings the bell and the dog thinks nothing of it, right? It means nothing to the animal. It's only a sound. And so then what he does is he presents
an unconditioned stimulus. So he says, I'm going to ring the bell, and then I'm going to show the dog food. And as of this point, the dog has no connection between the two, only that they are existing in the same time frame. So then the dog, of course, because the dog's hungry, salivates, right? And so that becomes a reflex or a reaction. So then he does it over and over and over and over. He rings the bell, shows the food, the dog salivates. Ring the bell, shows the food, dog salivates. And so what that does is it actually turns that conditioned stimulus into what we then call a conditioned response. So once the dog starts associating the bell with food and always salivates, then we can say that eventually we can ring the bell, not present the dog with food, and the dog will salivate, because now the dog has conditioned or is conditioned to associating the bell with food. So it's a good example. Of course, we don't have dogs in our classrooms, but this is the basis of where this came from. So here's, again, some elements that we can talk about when it comes to classical conditioning. The neutral stimulus. So anything prior to then conditioning that doesn't provoke a response. So a bell, you can see other things that could be a neutral stimulus. Food, that's one of my favorite examples, so don't read that too much, it's on the next slide. And then, of course, we have the unconditioned stimulus, so anything that occurs naturally. And in this case, I know it showed a picture of dog food, but it was actually just meat powder, which makes me feel bad for dogs. And then the conditioned stimulus. So because they have this example of food poisoning, and for me, that's probably the most solid example of a conditioned response or a conditioned behavior. So if you've ever had this happen to you, and Drew in this case, went to a restaurant and ordered scallops, and the scallops turned out to be contaminated, and he suffered from a bad case of food poisoning, probably for a few days, probably lost some weight, got dehydrated. If you've ever done it, it's no fun. So, does anyone have this happen to them? So now, whenever he sees scallops or smells them, he already feels nauseated. That association with what happened, he now feels nauseated. So you think he's going to want to eat scallops for a while? No. A quick, what was it? What was it that got you? A what?
A pizza place.
A pizza place.
They went out of business shortly after, so.
That's sad. I'm sorry. Others? A cheeseburger. Oh, so sad. Others? Another? Oh no.
Mine was like strawberries.
Strawberries. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, I've done it twice. Once was a burrito from Taco Bell.
Oh my god.
Yes, didn't eat Taco Bell for like 2 years. And then the other time I was in India and I ate a gulab jamun that wasn't refrigerated. Oops, my bad. It's basically like the inside of a donut. So it's squishy and doughy and delicious, and then they soak it in syrup. So it was good, but it's a bummer. So obviously, I have now a conditioned stimulus. I've eaten at Taco Bell since, but like I said, it took me a while to get back there. But what does this mean for you in the classroom? Because it's not like we're worried about food poisoning with our students. But what we are worried about is how can we condition them, and about not just like conditioning like things they want to do, but in education, we worry about conditioning, classical conditioning when it comes to humiliation and punishment. Because think about it, and you can probably think back to your elementary school days. I know myself as a student, I never wanted to hear my name called. It made me feel really scared because in my classroom, I imagine I was conditioned to thinking that a link between having your name called on and being called out by the teacher meant you're in trouble, right? It meant you're in trouble. So for me, I had a conditioned response to a fear of being, singled out. But as you can see here, if students associate negative emotional experience with school, then they obviously will have bad results. So if students are experiencing bullying in your classroom, if they, like when I was in 5th grade, I couldn't get my homework done because I was so behind because I had just moved. And every time I went in without my homework done, my teacher gave me a pink slip that had to go home and be signed by my parents. So I started having this conditioned response to, and this fear of not having my homework done because I would have this punitive slip sent home. And my mom ended up sending them all back to the teacher and said, I don't care about your pink slip. You're torturing my daughter. So when we think about classical conditioning, we need to actually turn the light not so much on our students, but on ourselves as teachers and think about, is there something going on in my classroom, or is there something I'm doing with my discipline that is causing my students to be classically conditioned or have some fear about being in school? That's the last thing we want them to do. We want them to be there and we want them to feel safe, right? We talked about Maslow last week. And so, our other classical theory of behaviorism is operant conditioning. And this one, because this one is always tricky, but basically what this theory, and this is Skinner, and so what he says is there's, the behavior again is that change and have you learned, right? Have you learned and is your behavior changed? So there's always an antecedent, something that comes before, and then the behavior and the consequence. And this is the part, it's hard sometimes, but we'll do it, we'll be fine. So the consequences can be positive or negative, and they can be punishment or reinforcement. So we'll have to make some examples of this, but as you can see, positive reinforcement means that good stuff happens, and there we increase the behavior. So we're reinforcing the behavior when something good happens. Negative punishment means we want to stop the behavior, negative, and so we take away something to decrease the behavior. So the negative means take away, and the positive means giving, okay? And then we keep going down. Positive punishment, that's something bad happened, and we give a punishment to decrease the behavior. And then finally, negative reinforcement, bad stuff stops, so we take away something to hopefully encourage the behavior. So I think I have this is it. So, although the dog part always confuses me, but let's kind of put our brains into this and work together, and then of course, you're great at this. All right, so positive reinforcement. So we have a behavior that we see that we like, and we want to give something to reinforce it. Can anyone help me with an example? What could be a classroom example of that? We see a behavior we want, and we want to do something to reinforce it. Maureen?
Like giving gold stars to people who participate.
Yeah, gold stars, stickers. So you're rewarding the behavior by giving something. And hopefully then the child learns, oh, the teacher likes this, so I'm going to do it again. The behavior will be repeated. Okay, so next let's go into, it's a reinforcement, but it's negative. This is where it gets tricky.
So, yeah. So the example of this would be like, you turned in your homework every day, so now I'm going to take away, you don't have to do another assignment, right? I'm going to take one away from you because you've done them all. So it's rewarding, like you did all your homework, so now you have to do one less, right? But I'm actually taking something from you, right? Or, yeah.
I think of maybe let's put it out to your brains. Can anyone do another one? Can you think of an example where you would take something away to reward a student? Think along those same lines as what Dr. Zimmerman. Something that's a responsibility. Yes. Yeah, that's a great example. And you'll even see that in university classes, right? Like if you get a certain amount of points on your first 5 tests, then the last one can be dropped. You don't have to do it anymore. Good example.
Oftentimes you would use this with a student who traditionally has already shown a lot of negative. So you would be like, you're on a behavior plan right now but as soon as I see the behaviors increase, like, you're on a behavior plan, so you have limited recess, right? But once you were successful at keeping your hands to yourself every day at recess, now I'm taking that away. Now you have your recess time back, right? I'm taking away the negative reinforcer that you couldn't go to recess.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So now let's talk about punishment. Let's go positive first. So positive punishment, giving something to decrease the behavior. This is pretty easy. I'm sure you probably had this in high school and middle school. Anyone? I heard it. Detention.
Or suspension or any. I mean, that's your education bread and butter.
Yep. Sadly.
That's sad, but it's true.
That's true. All right, so we know what that looks like, right? And I guess in a parenting, this would be like a spanking, right? Giving something to stop a behavior. So we'll talk about that, but they talk about it here. All right, and then negative punishment, taking away something to punish a student. Right, taking away recess. What else? What else could you take away?
Like if a classroom has like money, you could like say, "Oh, I'm charging you $1 for like speaking out of turn." Not doing
Like, yeah, so they use a lot of dojo points now. The teachers give points they could probably take. What else? Oh, you know what? And I need to mention a positive punishment that you never want to do is to give students exercise. Okay, like making them do more exercise or go run out around the track, or you never want because again, we're talking about behavior being learned. So if you use exercise as a punishment, do you think students are going to grow up and have a positive association with exercise? No. So absolutely, we must stay away from that, right? We want to nurture our athletes. We don't want people to not like to be physically active. And as we talked about last week, just helping our students like being physically active is really important to their physical development, right? To make sure they're healthy. So always positive when we have that to talk about. Next. Yes.
So in the book, it said that things like doing homework passes or like sometimes even like giving points or like classroom money like could cause students to like not like it would have like they call it like situational compliance instead of like wanting to just do the right thing.
Yes.
So like, is it bad to like give like tally points like to students or like?
We'll talk about that as we get a little further into this, but it's largely dependent on your group. And what I will say, I mean, for behavior in general, what happens and what works with one group won't necessarily work with your next group or your next group. And that goes the same with you all, right? The way I talk to you and the way we work together is dependent on you and your learning styles and who's in front of me. And so sometimes the tally mark thing might work with one group really, really well, and they love it. And other groups, it'll be something that you'll see that drop, and it won't be something that makes them motivated. So when we talk about motivators, you're going to really need to focus on what do your students like? What's important to them? Because if you try and motivate your students with something that means nothing to them, it will do you no good. So we'll chat, but let's keep going. Let's see. This is basically what we just did, so we're not going to do that. And this is the verses, keep going. But this is an example. Let me see, positive, yeah, negative. So this is much like what we just talked about. And you can see in here, like I said, the corporal punishment goes under the positive punishment, so the spanking. Of course, teachers never spank children, never touch children. FYI. And then, of course, moving, blah, 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 blah. So, extinction. That's what it says, extinction, is I believe. Is basically if you keep doing something as a reinforcement or as a punishment and students, it doesn't make a difference to them, maybe it's not motivating them, what'll happen is it's called extinction. Or a lot of times you can keep doing the same thing, but the weight of it kind of loses interest with your students, and so their behavior, even though, I could say, okay, everyone, we're gonna line up at the door, right? And we're gonna practice lining up in the door. And I give you positive reinforcement and I talk to you and I praise you about how you're doing it. But eventually, 2 weeks into the school year, it'll probably still work. And a month, and 2 months, it'll keep working, right? But if you stop giving that reward, a lot of times what happens is the behavior becomes extinct. So if you stop praising them, or at least telling them, like, I really like the way that you all are lining up, like, you can't just think that once they've got it, it's going to be great and you can move on to something else. You always have to be consistently reinforcing what you want your students to do. So that's where extinction comes into play. Ha ha ha, you know I like my little cartoons. So, what is this example of? Is it positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment? Shout it out.
Positive punishment.
Correct. Did anyone ever get soap in the mouth as a child? No.
I totally did. What?
Oh, one there?
That's generation.
I had the threat, but I never got it. And my mom spanked me once with a wooden spoon, but not very hard. So, positive punishment. So, as we said, behavior is reinforced when it's repeated or strengthened. And behavior which is not reinforced tends to die out or become extinct. So like the example with the line, one of the biggest things, of course, is like every teacher, your worst fear is walking by your principal with your line and all your students are, So again, if you want them to continue doing what you expect them to do, you have to reinforce it. You have to talk to them about it and tell them that you appreciate their behavior. I do a lot of dancing in here. We danced last week. She taught the dance club with me with all the students. I even did the.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I'm good. But I showed them the video of the parade, so
That was good.
she was there. It was good times. All right, so now here we are with what you were kind of wanting to dip into. So we have two types of motivators. The first one is extrinsic. And if you know, what's the word for like before, prefixes? X means what?
Outside.
Outside, external, right? So extrinsic motivation are things that often involve compensation or punishment or certain types of rewards. And these are examples, but you can see badges, gold stars, money, points, like a reward box, treasure chest of sorts. And then again, also fear of failure, fear of punishment. So these are external things. So again, you see now, oh, see the carrot on the stick? That first picture is kind of making sense, right? Now let's look at the next. Remember, if you want to have a picture of the slide, you're always welcome to take a shot with your smartphones. But I always have this online after class on Blackboard. All right, so again, extrinsic reinforcers that come out from the outside environment, and it could be as simple as praise, money, or stickers. But when it comes to praise, what kind of praise is the best? We kind of talked about this when we talked about mindset. What kind of praise is the best?
It's like about how hard they work.
Right, praising the process. Okay, so remember, when you're doing extrinsic motivation based on praise, you need to praise the process. You don't want to give students toxic praise. Toxic praise is...
You're so smart.
Huh?
You're so smart.
Silly. Thanks. I'm impressing
That's
her.
a toxic praise right there.
Yes, that's right. So, and it worked, right? I felt good about myself, but it doesn't actually help. So telling someone you're so smart. Another one that's kind of materialistic and gender-based, you know, like, oh, your dress is so pretty. Oh, your hair looks so nice today. Like, it's not bad to tell students nice things, but if that's the only praise you're giving them, then that's what they feel like that's the only thing they're good at. Okay? So we need
Their value depends upon their appearance.
their appearance and things they have. And that's hard because, let me tell you, they got some really cute sparkly shoes, cool things.
You can still tell them that you like it.
Yeah.
It's real hard not to.
It's, yeah. But again, we have to make sure that we're praising students' effort and we're praising their process. So a little bit of everything. So next, this is the gold standard. But not every student is ready for this, and it won't necessarily always work. But we need to know that there's a balance between these two things. So intrinsic, in meaning inside, within. It is things like autonomy, mastery, or having a purpose. So when you look at like the Maslow's hierarchy, that's going to be the upper ones. The things like the, what's it called? The self, we can't even remember. You know what I mean?
Self-actualization.
Thank you. The self-actualization, all of that up there. So in terms of, and this is why it's hard, because a reward is learning something. A reward is belonging. A reward is mastery. A lot of children, if they don't have this thought process of why they're at school and that they want to be there to learn, these kind of things won't really hit home with them. It won't really work as a reinforcement for them. But what we want to do is we want to try and push them towards understanding and needing this kind of praise, or needing this kind of motivator. So you all are kind of intrinsically motivated. Even though you're here and you need a grade, right? That's ultimately what you're going to get out of this class. But you also want to be teachers, right? So you're here for a reason, and for an intrinsic reason. You're motivated because you want to master child development so you could be a better teacher. You're motivated because you want to get these classes done so you can get into a credential program and get into the classroom. And then, of course, love.
All good motivators generally take from both sides, right? So like, for example, I love my job and it makes me feel fulfilled and I get to give back, but and that gives me a sense of like purpose and fulfillment, but I also get paid. And I probably wouldn't do it if I didn't get paid, right? But it's both things, right? And that's why, you're here for both things too. You get a grade, you're going to get a degree, right? You're getting something extrinsic, but it also fills that need, and like your need, right? Personally, I feel fulfilled by doing these things and helping my students, that type of thing. Just like it would with you. Any good program at school would have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation.
Right, because if you think about it, your classroom is going to have students that might be intrinsically motivated. There's also going to be students that need that external, that need the little extra push or a gold star. So a good balance is right where it's at. What happened? Okay. Oh, no. Oh, you know what? I think I'm zoomed in. No, I'm not. Oh. Am I going the wrong way? Other way. No. That one. One more. There it is. Thank you. So now this makes more sense to you, right? Yeah? So you can see on the right-hand side, those are the what kind of motivators? Stay right. Take a look at it. I'm sorry. Your left, my right. Yeah. Yes. Right. And so you understand now that the heart on fire is not a heart on. It's something internally that makes you want to do something, right? So those are all excellent examples. Now before we transition, can you go to the next one? This is just a little example of positive reinforcement, something called token economies. Have you ever heard of this? Yeah? So some teachers will do this. You might have a token economy based on dojo points. Let's see, what else? You could have a token economy just based on tickets. So when I taught 7th grade pre-algebra over summer school, everyone hated me. They didn't want to be there at all. So I had to give them external reinforcement every time someone answered a question. They got a ticket. And that's really hard. 7th graders steal from each other. But they kept their tickets. And when they got 10 tickets, I had a box of chips from Costco that they could pick from. And that motivated them because middle schoolers love food. And you remember that time when you're like, yeah, I can eat whenever I want. Yeah, I can chew gum. So those types of things work really well.
Now they have class credit cards that you can like put points on and stuff.
That's something. I've seen, is that like dojo?
No, it's like an actual physical, like, card-stopped card that comes laminated, and you can, like, it scans on your phone, and you can, like, give points, and they can have them be a credit on their card, and they can spend them at your, like, student store, and they can spend them around. Yeah.
So it's very interesting, right? But again, when you decide on how you want to run your classroom and how you want to do your motivation, again, this is a token economy. So the idea of a card or tickets is very much capitalistic, right? I mean, if you haven't studied economics, that's what that is. Yeah. And so we kind of like, that's a good idea. For some students, it would definitely motivate them. But again, if you think about collective cultures and individualist cultures, some cultures aren't as focused on capital and gain and that sort of thing. So it could work with some and not with others. you can also tie it into your curriculum, which is one way I really like, because then it becomes real for the students. So like if you're teaching 3rd grade, is that still 3rd grade where they teach Native Americans? Correct? Native Americans, 3rd grade. And so you can set up a token economy within your classroom that reflects Native American culture. So maybe it's not going to be money and tickets, but maybe it would be, we think about like abalone shells or these sorts of things. So maybe you don't literally have shells, but you might have little printouts that have a picture, and that's what it represents. So you can teach them in a way that, you know, there's many ways for cultures to have economies, but it's fun for students to live with that within a token economy and understand it. So yes. And finally, these are examples, and this is in your book, but I just wanted you to know. So behaviorism and the idea and the psychological background translates into direct instruction is usually the most linked pedagogy, or the way we teach in a classroom. So when you all get together and you talk and you work together, that's called social constructivism, right? It's less about me being a sage on the stage and giving you all knowledge, and it's more about you all working together and constructing knowledge. Well, direct instruction is that what you're probably used to. It's what you experienced probably in high school or middle school, not as much usually in elementary school, but it still exists, of course. But this is kind of the breakdown, and it's very one thing after another, very prescribed, and it usually involves memorization. So that's just FYI, and that's not for you all, so you don't need to worry about that. Before we switch to your topic, can you show them the pictures? Maybe minimize this. Where are they? Oh, they're in the drive. See the drive? There. Oh, yeah. Cool. And maybe, is it zoomable? Yeah, just a little. Perfect. Okay, so this is an example. This was my classroom when I was teaching. It's not perfect. I think if I could go back and teach again, there would be things I do differently. But I wanted you to take a look at these pictures and kind of see if you can see, because this is the front of my room, see if you can see things that I might have used for behavior management or kind of classroom management. Raise your hand if you think you see something. Right over here.
I don't know what it is. Stars in the water.
Yes, you caught it. Okay, so see those? Oh, thank you. I love it. Like that away. So what I used to do is I would say, you know, when you all get to 10 stars, we're going to have, 5 minutes extra recess. And so I would draw a star if they were doing a good job on the board. And usually if I got near the board with a marker and everyone was kind of quiet, but that side of the room was talking, you would see like a hush going across the room. Right? She's there. She has a marker. And everyone starts moving. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I think you all deserve a star. And so I would right? But as I would get closer, sometimes I felt like, oh, well, I'm giving them too many stars, we're getting close. So you have to kind of drag it out sometimes. So I used to draw little shoes and eyes, and that one turned into a butterfly. And they loved it. So, you know what I'm saying? So maybe it wasn't like the whole classroom was doing good behavior, but I wanted to recognize, so I'd be like, okay, I'm going to give this star some eyeballs to decide. Great. So get closer.
And there's this too. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, well, let's see if they can find them. Sorry. Yes? The lily pads. Did I already tell you about the lily pads? No? Okay. So, Principal Zimmerman will tell you how she feels about card systems and clip systems. You'll see plenty of them, I'm sure, in your classroom. I personally don't like card systems either. There's nothing worse than looking up to the front of your classroom and seeing your name with a red card next to it, or the feeling of having to go and pull your card and everyone gets to see you. What's that called?
Like
public humiliation, public shaming. Yeah. So kind of not good. But what I used to do is I had sparkly wrapping paper that was blue. stuck it to the board. And I had all these lily pads, so obviously my team was frogs. Right? My students thought I loved frogs. I don't like them, they're gross. But they liked it, so it's cute. So basically what happened is each lily pad was usually kind of like a disciplinary action. So maybe like if a student, I had to ask a student a second time after giving a warning for them to stop a behavior, then I would just slide their frog over onto the yellow lily pad. So the lily pads had this one yellow, orange, pink, and purple. I also like that there's no red. I mean, pink is red, but stay away from red. It's a conditions response. How many of you like getting a paper back with red written all over it? No. When you can put your papers to me, my writing will be in purple or green or blue or black, but not red. So anyway, so basically I would just scoot their frog over, and then I give them the option. Basically, if I saw their behavior changing, I would make an announcement to everyone. I would just walk over and push their frog back into the pond. And that's like, they were motivated. They wanted their frogs to be in the pond with everyone. But they're so small that you can't really see whose name it is. So it was really more of a personal thing for them to keep track of their frog. Let's see, there's a few more.
The rules.
The rules. And Principal Zimmerman will talk about rules, but you can see my rules were be respectful, be responsible, be kind, be safe, and then always try your best. So really basic rules. She'll talk about why that's important. And let's see, there's one more thing. You might have a hard time seeing it here. And then we'll switch to a different picture. Oh no, there's two more things here. There's a lot. Can I give you a hint? You don't know what it is, but look at it now that I show you. What do you think that is? It's a treasure box. It's full of pencils and pencil sharpeners and erasers and stuff. And so I had a ticket system in my classroom, but I believe it was like at the end of the day, if you had all great behaviors and you did a good job, they got a ticket, they wrote their name on it, and they popped it in this box. And then on Friday, I would pull 5 tickets. They could go in there. Okay, and okay, I'm just gonna tell you right here. This is more about like procedure and management. But over here, see these two little things? What does that look like? Hand sanitizer, yeah. And space. So basically, that's what they used as bathroom passes, and that's how they kept track of their things. And they had to put their number on the board because first grade, they want to go to the bathroom like every 10 seconds. So I never said, no, you can't go to the bathroom, but when they went to get their pass, they had to make a note of their number. And so that way I would track to see who's gone to the bathroom like a million times in the day, because otherwise you lose track. And really what you're worried about with your students is instructional time. You don't want them to be out of the classroom missing out on instruction. So that's kind of how I track that. And then can we switch to the other picture? There's one more thing I want to share with you. Thank you. So again, you can see that's where it was. Every day I used to hang the homework there so they knew what we were doing. Here you can't tell, but each group, their name was here, and then this is where they put the point, where I put the tallies for the points. So they had group points, they had whole group points with the stars, they had individual motivator with the tickets. So you see what I'm saying? Like you can't just do one thing and hope it will blanket cover your students and motivate them. You have to do a lot of different ways to motivate your students. But what I'd like to point out, if we can zoom in, right here, I called it my SSS board, or my SSS poster, Secret Silent Signals. And this again isn't about
Classroom procedure.
Yeah, it's not so much management, but
Classroom procedures help management.
So there's nothing, like, it's really frustrating when you teach first grade and every 10 seconds someone's like, Mrs. Sam, I have to go to the bathroom. Mrs. Sam, can I go to the trash can? Mrs. Sam, I need a bandage. Mrs. Sam, like constant, right? And I love them and they're great, but I don't have time always to hear every single sentence because sometimes they're lengthy and expressing themselves. So this is how I gave them a way to express themselves to me quickly, quietly, and the most important thing is it didn't get my teaching off track, right? Because when you're distracted and you get off track, then you lose your whole pace. You lose the pace of the classroom. If I said you guys like, oh, I'm gonna go over here and
and talk, what are you going to do? You're probably going to turn to your neighbors and shoot a chat. And then we've lost the pace of our class, right? So these signals I had, and you can't really see it, and I still kicked myself for giving it away when I moved to San Diego and stopped being a teacher. But if they need a pencil from the pencil basket, because they don't sharpen during class, all they did was go like this. And I would simply, can you show me? Or with your finger. And I would go, that's it. So easy.
And it's the same with like so did you notice that all of her classroom management systems don't require any speaking, right? Like if I see you're doing the right thing, I can just give you a ticket without acknowledging it. Or I can write a star on the board and move on quickly, right? So that,
or I can say, I don't want to sing with you.
Sure.
And again, I wouldn't say, Stella, you're not doing your work. I'm moving your prompt to the yellow lily pad.
Yeah. Or move it and talk to them later after.
But the point is, again, we don't want to publicly shame, and mostly we don't want to take that time out to stop the entire progression of the class to single out a child. It's just not worth it. Bathroom, 2 fingers, gotta go. And that really helps, because then you don't have like, I have to go, because they do, right? It's just like this. Okay, and then trash can, looks like trash can was 2. But they will ask you 17 billion times if they and then tissue, which is really important during cold season, was 3 fingers. And sometimes they just went like this, which they actually did that themselves. They were. And then finally, just a hand. Like if it doesn't fall under any of these, then also your hand up. But you see how many questions were eliminated by having those there. And they learn them very fast.
That's 3 before me.
Thank you. And that's another thing I'm actually going to post it onto the story on Snapchat and Instagram. But teachers will do something where they have like,
I had a no talking tiara that I would wear, like when I was wearing it, you weren't allowed to ask me any questions. You had to try to find the answer from a friend.
Yeah, I like that. Or like a picture frame that says, I'll show you the picture, it says ask 3 before 8, which is great, right? And which is what I encourage you all to do when you have questions. I say, well, first you listen to this, then ask your partners in your group. And well, I guess that's only 2 spots, but here it is. So we always want to encourage our students to be self-sufficient and more independent. And that gives you as a teacher more time to do what you need to do. Right? Teach.
And with like, for example, in Cassie's room right here, those students would be like, they can read the classroom and look around the room and find the answer, right? So the reason for like a no talking tiara or an ask 3 before me is because the answer is there. It's already there, right? They just have to figure out how to get it for themselves, which is something that they're going to need to do in academics all the time, right? If the answer is already out, you wouldn't want to, it's hard when teachers do things like that and then they have blank walls or, they haven't been clear. So keep that in mind too, right? You don't want to frustrate kids. It needs to be readily available for them to find the answers to things that they're asking. Much like plugging that hard. Plug that syllabus.
Well, in a university, that's like your contract between you and the professor. That's where you go. So, with that said, I don't know. How do you use a PC? I'll do it for you. I downloaded it. Great.
Do you usually take a break or do you need a minute?
Well, they can take 10 now if you want and then start fresh when they come back.
It's up to you guys. Do you want me to start or you want to take your break and then I'll start? I heard some breaks.
You won't hurt her feelings.
It's fine. Take a break.
See you in 12 minutes.
Hey, McKenna. Hello, how are you? Thank you. My hair. Have someone do it because I don't know how to do it.
You know how to do it?
I don't even know how to braid. Like, I have daughters.
Oh, I love braiding. Like, I do all my roommates' hair and stuff.
I literally wish. Are you a sorority? Oh, I wish I could. Oh, yeah, me too. I have a bunch of stuff there. Anyway, it
Oh,
looks
there's
good.
definitely.
Sorry, it's recording.
I was just like, hey, it's all good. It's all good.